Okay, so today we're going to look into something pretty heavy, actually.
Yeah.
We're going to Isla Vista, California, back in 2001.
Right.
And this is a deep dive into, well, it was a vehicular incident, but it had a lot of impact and a lot of fatalities, unfortunately.
Yeah. A very tragic case.
Yeah. So we're looking at this excerpt from Wikipedia,
Okay.
and this is from the 2001 Isla Vista killings page, and it gives us like sort of the factual overview.
Yeah, it gives us a really good basis of,
Mhm.
what happened, the immediate response, and then the legal action afterwards.
Right. So the idea here is we want to try to understand the anatomy of this tragedy, but also how do the legal and mental health systems kind of like interact
Yeah.
when something like this happens, and then what were the long-term consequences for the community there?
Absolutely.
So yeah, let's just dive right into it. Where do we even begin?
So the incident itself happened on February 23rd, 2001, just after 11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
Okay.
And the location was the 6500 block of Sabado Tartar Road in Isla Vista. And the source points out that this is an area very heavily populated by students.
Yeah.
Near UC Santa Barbara.
Right next to UCSB, and this is where David Attias comes in, 18 years old at the time.
UCSB student himself.
Right, and his father is Dan Attias.
And this is something that I think brought this to a lot more people's attention, is the fact that his father was a television director.
Yeah, that's right. He was involved in some pretty big shows, too.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the vehicle involved here was his father's 1991 Saab 9000.
A Saab 9000.
Now, the way that this happened, it was really devastating.
Yes.
Attias was driving his car down this road, and he was going incredibly fast.
Yeah, somewhere between 50 and 65 miles per hour.
Just plowing through pedestrians on the street, and so many people were hit.
It's awful.
Yeah, the immediate aftermath of this was just, I mean, it's really disturbing.
Oh, absolutely.
He gets out of the car and he's yelling, "I am the angel of death,"
Oh, my gosh.
and just taunting the crowd.
Oh, wow.
You can't even imagine being there in that moment.
I can't.
It must have been terrifying.
Absolutely.
Until a California Highway Patrol officer subdues him.
Wow.
And then we get to this interesting part where there's all this uncertainty about his state of mind.
Was it drug-induced or was it intentional?
Yeah, what was going on? And so they did blood tests and they found marijuana and lidocaine.
But neither of those were deemed to be significant factors contributing to the incident.
Right. So it leaves this big question mark of like, what else was going on here?
Exactly.
And so sadly, 4 people died at the scene.
Yes. And these were Nicholas Bordakis and Christopher Davis, both 20 years old, UCSB students.
It's just so sad to hear that.
And then Eli Israel, a 27-year-old from San Francisco, and Ruth Levy, a 20-year-old student at Santa Barbara City College.
So young, just unbelievable.
Yes, and tragically, there was actually a 5th person who was critically injured that night.
Oh, wow.
Albert Arthur Levy Ruth's 27-year-old brother.
Okay.
And he survived the initial impact.
Oh, my God.
But he had just devastating injuries like crushed legs, a severely battered head, and he actually died in October 2016 from complications
Wow.
from those injuries. And it says here specifically from seizures.
Oh, my goodness.
So ultimately, this incident claimed 5 lives.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom that.
Yeah,
So then we move to this sort of legal process.
right.
Attias is charged with so many things. 4 counts for murder, 4 counts of vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence, 5 counts of felony driving under the influence.
Right. And it's important to understand that vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence, that essentially means causing death while you're operating a vehicle with a significant disregard for human safety.
Yeah, that's basically saying like you just didn't care
Right.
at all.
Exactly.
And then it gets interesting because we start to hear about some background information on Attias, and this
Yeah.
is leading up to the incident.
Right.
People who lived in the same student housing as him, they said that he was behaving very erratically.
Yeah, there were allegations of stalking another student, and some students even had nicknames for him, like Crazy Dave and Tweaker.
That's just so disturbing.
Yeah, it is.
It kind of paints this picture of someone who is really struggling.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then of
Right.
course his father being this, Hollywood figure,
Definitely amplified the media attention surrounding this case.
huge media attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Attias enters this plea of not guilty by reason of insanity,
Right.
which is a really important legal thing.
It basically means that the defendant is claiming that they weren't mentally capable of understanding what they were doing or that it was wrong at the time of the crime.
Yeah, they're saying I wasn't in my right mind.
Right.
And so it leads to this trial, and as you can imagine, it was very public.
Yeah, this trial got a ton of attention.
The jury finally reaches a verdict on June 11th, 2002.
And they found Atias guilty of 4 counts of second-degree murder.
Okay.
But interestingly, he was actually acquitted of the driving under the influence charges.
So second-degree murder, that's basically saying that there was malice, but it wasn't planned out like first-degree murder, right?
That's right.
Okay. But the story doesn't end there.
It doesn't. 1 week later, that same jury had to consider the question of his sanity at the time of the killings.
Yeah.
And they found Atias to be legally insane.
Wow. So they're saying because of a mental defect, he couldn't understand that what he was doing was a crime.
Right.
Or control his actions.
Exactly.
And so that changes the sentencing.
Right. Instead of prison, Atias was committed to Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino.
Okay.
And this is a state facility that provides mental health treatment.
So this really highlights the intersection between mental health and the legal system.
Yeah. It's a complicated situation for sure.
So the source mentions that a memorial was set up in Little Acorn Park.
Right. And this park is really close to where the incident happened.
Just a reminder of this awful tragedy.
Absolutely a place for the community to remember the victims.
But the story doesn't stop there because years later, in May 2012, Atias asked to be moved from Patton State Hospital to an outpatient facility.
Yeah.
So he was claiming that his bipolar disorder was now under control.
And they mentioned that he was receiving treatment not only for substance abuse issues, but also for pervasive developmental disorder.
Right, which is like when someone has delays in developing basic functions like social skills and communication.
Exactly.
And of course, you can imagine that the survivors and the families of the victims were really worried about this.
Absolutely.
They were scared.
Yeah, they voiced their concerns in court when this was being discussed.
Right.
And there was even testimony from mental health professionals who assessed his condition.
But in September 2012, the court agreed to a conditional release.
So he was moved from Patton to this supervised outpatient treatment program.
Which must have been really difficult for the people who were so deeply impacted by this.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it really brings up these questions about treatment and reintegrating people back into society.
It's a really difficult balance to strike, between public safety and the individual's right to treatment.
Right, and the possibility that they could actually change.
Exactly.
So when we look back on this whole incident, the 2001 Isla Vista killings, it's so devastating.
It really is. We see this young man driving recklessly, taking the lives of 4 people, with a 5th person dying years later from their injuries.
It's just unbelievable.
And it's not just the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
There were those intense legal proceedings.
Right, trying to figure out intent, insanity.
And the impact of this event, it's still felt today, with the memorial and the anxiety surrounding Atias's release.
Yeah, and it really shows how mental health and criminal responsibility are so intertwined.
It's a complex issue for sure.
And I think what's really interesting here is that this incident, even though it happened so long ago, it forces us to ask some really tough questions.
Right.
What are the responsibilities of the legal system and the mental health system when something like this happens? And how do communities heal after such a horrific event?
And that leads me to a question. We think about this. What does this incident, even after all these years, reveal about our systems and how we understand these kinds of tragedies?
Yeah.
It really pushes us to think about criminal accountability, the complexities of mental health treatment in the justice system, and the incredibly challenging process of reintegrating someone into society after they've done something so destructive.
It's a lot to consider for sure.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
Well, thanks for bringing this to light.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
It's been a really insightful discussion.
Yeah, I agree.
And for everyone listening, I hope this has given you some things to think about as well.
I hope so.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.